Hi, everybody. Okay, I'll just get right started here. I'll start with an introduction. My name is Andy Roebuck. I'm an assistant professor in psychology here at Yukon University. So I think I have the shortest commute to have got here today, yet I was still updating PowerPoint slides over the lunch break. So maybe it's a me thing. So my background really, although I teach in the psych department, I am a behavioral neuroscientist. I study neuropharmacology. So drugs in the brain is usually what I'm studying. And what I'm going to try and convince you of here is two things today. One, that vitamin D, we can conceptualize it with the same framework, drugs in the brain. And two, that wherever you are in Canada, you live in the north. And so you need to start considering things about vitamin D. Last thing I will say is that I am a researcher. I am not a healthcare professional. I am not a nurse. I am not a nutritionist. So the things that you usually think about people telling you about health and well-being, I don't do any of the useful stuff. So this isn't medical advice for you. It's what the data says for us. So I'm not giving you advice. That's the caveat out of the way. So I obviously want to start with a quiz because I'm an instructor and I accidentally advanced too far. So the first question, hopefully everyone knows the answer to this. How is vitamin D produced? It's produced following exposure to UVB light. So ultraviolet light. So that was a gimme question. I know instructor makes a mistake, you get free marks. So, maybe, there we go. How far north do you need to be before vitamin D production is severely impacted? San Francisco, Vancouver, Prince George, or Whitehorse? You can answer aloud, you can answer to yourself. There's no grades. Oh, we're gonna go with San Francisco. If you live above the 37th parallel, there is nobody in Northern California who conceptualizes themselves as a northern resident. Yet, even that far south, at least 3 months of the year, they cannot produce vitamin D following exposure to UVB light. So some estimates here, Toronto, about the 43rd parallel, about 4 months of the year, UVB light is insufficient to produce vitamin D. Edmonton, about 5 months of the year. We're moving north, we're in Whitehorse, we're around 6 months of the year. Even if you're standing outside naked in the middle of winter, I know we all love to do it, but no vitamin D production. Dawson City, Old Crow, as you go further and further north, the span of time when you cannot produce vitamin D following exposure to sunlight increases and increases. These towns, like in Edmonton, maybe a bit north, but not a lot of people conceptualize themselves as northern when they live in Toronto, unless if they're talking about like a Raptors game or comparing themselves to the US. So what I want to be clear here is that the further north you go, the more of an issue this becomes. But for everyone in Canada, for at least 3-4 months of the year, this is something that needs to be considered. So the quiz continues. Most of this is quiz, it turns out. You're outside a lot in the summer. I don't need vitamin D, I'll have enough stored up. True or false? You can probably see where I'm going here. Leading question, false. It's unlikely that you can maintain stores of vitamin D throughout the winter. Sorry. Okay, maybe I've convinced you here and you accept that vitamin D production is something to think about. So you're gonna sit there and bask in front of a window like this happy little cat here. I love ruining things. Turns out most window glass blocks UVB light, preventing production of vitamin D. But it gets better. You know that skin lotion that you put on so you look as well rested as I do right now? Yeah, it turns out even SPS 15 sunscreen blocks most 90 to 99% of vitamin D production. So basically no sunscreen outside all the time. Obviously there are other considerations there. One last question. So a lot of people will know that we have vitamin D fortified foods. So you would imagine that we've thought about this as society. We've adapted to this problem. Milk, grains, juice, eggs, salmon. Yeah, obviously the purpose of my talk here is to emphasize that we are not getting enough vitamin D. Conservative estimates suggest about 1 billion people worldwide are likely deficient or insufficient in vitamin D. And it isn't always people in the north. Many very hot equatorial climates, people can be deficient in vitamin D because they live lifestyles or wear clothing that prevents UVB exposure to their skin. So it isn't just about being north, it's about exposure to vitamin D generally. Check my time. So how much do we need? Well, here's some guidelines from the Yukon. You might recognize that I am an individual ages 1 to 70. I know, huge range. 600 international units a day. This is the same recommendation that you would see in Vancouver, the same recommendation you would see in San Francisco, and it's pretty standard. It also really hasn't changed much in the last several decades. So just keep that in mind when we talk about vitamin D. We're still getting the same kind of information that someone far further south might get. Where can you get it from your food? Well, there's a few sources. I, like everyone else, eats 10 eggs a day to get my vitamin D. I'm assuming that's how everyone starts a day, or 6 cups of milk a day to meet this minimum requirement of vitamin D. The reality is most people can't supplement from diet alone. Some of the few sources that are high in vitamin D, we are seeing dietary patterns change where people are consuming a lot less of it. Salmon, cod liver oil, organ meats, liver. People aren't eating as much of this, and these were traditional sources rich in vitamin D, particularly important in northern communities. So you can take quite a lot of vitamin D. The upper limit's about 4,000 IU, just for your own information. So if you're taking 1,000 a day, which is a pretty typical formulation you might get, you're well within kind of this expected range. So vitamin D produced in response to UVB light. But what we see is that deficiency, even though we can get it from the sunlight, no one can kind of commodify it in the same way that we with many other things. Deficiency is still quite common. It hasn't been studied as well as you might think. Studies that have looked at it in the Northern Territories, in Alaska, and in the prairies find ranges anywhere from 63 to 100% vitamin D insufficiency in their sample populations. So however you define north, it seems like wherever you look, we're seeing a lot of deficiency. Deficiency levels are also not equal. People who have a darker skin complexion are more likely to have low levels of vitamin D. Of an older age, depending on pregnancy status, your activity levels, time spent outside, all of these can factor into vitamin D deficiencies. Weather, clouds, like today, that's also going to impact it. So vitamin D, it's essential for bone health. That's what we always hear, bones and teeth, bones and teeth. I'm a psych person talking about the brain. Yes, I get it. I don't want anyone to have rickets either. But there are other complications and consequences with vitamin D insufficiency outside of bones. I know there's a lot of kinesiology people here. I get it. Bones and muscles are important, but I want a brain to have a cushy ride, so I care about the skeletal system, but we all know who the real hero is. So vitamin D, it's involved in a lot of other physiological processes. Immune function, prevention of illness, muscle function and strength, cardiovascular health, digestion, glycemic control. There's some good evidence, especially later in life, that it might be implicated in type 2 diabetes. Neuron growth and stability. Oh, now I start to care more, see? And dopamine regulation, important for things like mood, pleasure, feelings of reward, and movement. There's a lot of other things here. We're going to skirt over most of them. I will note that excessive vitamin D can have consequences. So I've seen it quite a lot online these days, people promoting these super high doses of vitamin D. This can really only occur if someone's taking, 10 supplements a day. It's pretty atypical to have excessive vitamin D or hypercalcemia as a result of just typical dietary patterns. But there are some kind of alternative dietary strategies promoted by weird influencers that are like 40,000 IU a day. So that it can have consequences. But typical day-to-day, eating your dozen eggs a day, you're probably not going to hit that barrier. So just check my time here. Vitamin D, it's very heavily involved in a number of different neurological processes. I know we're a pretty diverse crowd here, so not everyone's coming from the health world. People are coming from more of a social perspective. So I'll just hit it from a broad barrier. Vitamin D affects most cells in the body. It affects neurons, or the brain cells of your brain, and affects your glial cells, or your support cells in the nervous system as well. Glial cells include these astrocytes. They do a lot of supportive functions. We tend to ignore them. They're critical for brain health. Microglia, which act kind of as the immune system for the central nervous system. And oligodendrocytes. They produce the insulation around neurons called myelin. So vitamin D receptors are found on all these cell types. They have a number of complex cellular functions. They regulate a number of different gene expression across a number of different approaches. We're not going to get into the specifics of this today, but just what I want to say is it impacts health of the brain across the lifespan. And so I pulled a few examples of this. So in early life, an area where I'm quite interested as a researcher, so the prenatal, infancy and childhood period, we see that deficiency is associated with an increased likelihood to develop ADHD, autism spectrum disorders, anxiety, depression, mild cognitive impairment, and schizophrenia. So these data have been demonstrated a few different times in a few different ways. So we do know vitamin D plays a key role in early neural development, but it doesn't stop then. In adulthood, as in one example, vitamin D deficiency has been linked to a higher rate of depressive disorders and more depressive symptoms, increasing symptom severity. This seems to be independent of light exposure. So we often see these things looked at together. We know that people who spend more time in nature, more time outside, tend to have more positive depression symptoms. But independent of this, we do see vitamin D linked to aspects of depression. These mechanisms, as above, fairly well, or not well understood. There are actually quite a lot of questions here that we don't know. And so we still need to look a bit deeper. In later life, this is where we have seen a lot more relationships fleshed out. Development, progression, and severity of multiple sclerosis is strongly linked to vitamin D status. So for those of you who have a bit of background, you might know that MS is a demyelinating disorder in most cases. And what happens is basically the insulation around the wires in your brain degrades. This causes a number of different behavioral and cognitive symptoms, quite devastating. It seems that vitamin D status might actually predict more favorable outcomes in MS. Recent evidence, this was published in 2013, came from the National Alzheimer's Coordinating Dataset. They found a 40% reduction in the incidence and severity of dementia across 10-year span, comparing adults taking vitamin Ds versus those who were not. And so these are older adults. Now, there are limitations to this study anytime but broad survey, but the way I conceptualize it is even if we were we say it's a tenth of that, that's still a 5% reduction in the incidence and severity of dementia symptoms. So certainly a kind of interaction that needs to be explored more further, or more fully. Oh, cool. So I want to talk a little bit about what we're doing here. I'm fairly new to Yukon University, so I'm still getting everything going here. There's a lot going on with vitamin D. There's a lot of topics we didn't get to discuss. Neurotransmitters, immune response, stress signaling, all this other stuff that I would love to chat with you about afterwards if you care about these things. And there's a lot more details. There's a lot of nuance. I'm making a lot of generalizations because we have 15 minutes to cover a complex topic. But I want to talk about what we are starting to look at here. We want to start looking at neuroscience research in the North, done by the North, where the data is held in the North for the betterment of people who live in the North. And what we remember is, if you live anywhere north of the 37th parallel, this includes you. We care about you too. So my hope is that we can eventually do a lot, but it's going to take time to get this started. So we are still building a lot of conversations, connections, capacity building. This stuff's happening. I'll briefly cover some areas of research we started to explore, and then I'll talk about avenues for future connections. And I'm always happy to get feedback and have conversations as we go. So my main collaborators are at the U of S, mostly in the College of Med. And so these are the folks that I've been working with most closely. Right now, what we're doing is we're looking at a literature review and analysis, looking at health outcomes related to vitamin D in northern communities. Turns out the literatures, there is quite a lot of it, very disparate, hasn't been consolidated well. So we're looking for any themes, any kind of relationships that might have been missed. We're starting some preclinical mechanistic work. So anyone who's done developmental research knows that humans, it turns out we age really slow, and we don't always want to wait 25 years for data to come, so we want to start studying this in kind of a lab-based approach. So that's happening this summer. We'll do some vitamin D deficiency in pregnancy and measure the outcomes in our model systems. We're also going to be developing a survey looking at perceptions and attitudes of vitamin D in the North. So I talked about it earlier. A lot of people get information about how much vitamin D to take from things like Reddit. And it might surprise you to know, to find out that Reddit is not a reliable source for medical information. So I want to understand what people are taking, why are you taking it, what have you heard about these substances? And so that we're hoping to launch that broadly this winter sometime, and then we'll expand it out if it all goes according to plan. We're also looking at analyzing some birth cohort data with our collaborators at the U of S. So these projects, I do want to throw a big shout out to one of my science heroes and mentors, Dr. Wendy Marks. This is all part of a much broader project that CIHR has funded on the developmental origins of health and disease in Indigenous populations. So Wendy is an absolute superstar, Canada Research Chair. She's the best. And so she's really helping us get some of this started and one of our kind of pioneers. Last thing is the future. I mentioned that not everyone is impacted by vitamin D deficiency equally. So one example is older adults. We see increased susceptibility to vitamin D insufficiency. But we're also in the north. We see that Northern First Nations individuals and communities are more likely to be impacted by vitamin D insufficiency. A lot of traditional foods, salmon, liver, organ meats, were one of the primary dietary sources of vitamin D for centuries, thousands of years. How have these recent dietary changes that we're all well aware of impacted these communities? The reality is a lot of it hasn't been assessed. It's a clear, to me, direct link of the implications of changing environments and changing accessibility to traditional foods. There's even some research that suggests that Northern First Nations individuals might have different biological responses in the process and activation of vitamin D. They might do it more efficiently, they might do it differently. This has been proposed numerous times in the literature, but no one has ever actually assessed it. And I want to be clear, this doesn't necessarily mean things are more susceptible. They might be more resistant. And in which case, are our dosing regimens correct for all people equally? So someone who is a Northern First Nations individual receiving the same dose as someone who has a much fairer complexion like me? This question's never really been explored outside of kind of theoretical conversations. So these kinds of studies, the more focused stuff, they're in the planning stages, in the consultation stages. So hopefully, next time you all come back up here, which I assume everyone's just coming here in the summer to live, I know a great place to set up your tent in the forest that you can probably live for several weeks before someone kicks you out. It's the standard way to start living in the north. But maybe when you come up next time, I'll have more of this information ready to present. But these types of studies have to be done in consultation and partnership. We need to look at who are the community partners, who are the questions that they want to ask. Because fundamentally, as these projects move forward, we need to build partnerships that can help develop, guide, and own and benefit research. Individuals need to own research about themselves, and I can't do this about someone. I have to do it with them enthusiastically together. So it'll take years, and I know that it's going to take years to get this going, but that's really where we're looking. Now, I know I'm out of time. I have one last quiz question left, and everyone who lives in the Yukon will immediately know what's coming next. Who needs vitamin D? We all need the D. This was a real campaign launched by the Yukon government, and they didn't know this. They didn't. If you don't understand what the joke is here, please talk to the millennial in your lab or research group. They will explain it to you. But this was a real ad campaign. So that's everything. I'm happy to chat more if anyone has any questions, and all the best. Welcome to Whitehorse. Welcome to Yukon. Take care.